It is with great pleasure that I can talk to you about some of the pathways and possibilities to achieve 100% renewable electricity system in Austria, what the Austrian government plans to do, and what the Austrian government unfortunately doesn't plan to do yet, and what we as campaigning organization want to change. So first of all, in order to set the scene a bit, where all this comes from, Austria has been very long, for a very long time, the Austrian public has been critical, highly critical of nuclear energy. Ever since the 1978 referendum that ended up with a fairly small majority against the starting up of an already finished nuclear power plant in Zwentendorf, identical to the ones built in Germany, the older ones that had to be shut down after the Fukushima disaster. So from this anti-nuclear perspective, and that's what I had been working on, we were in touch with the Prime Minister's office before the Paris 2015 climate conference. And we were in touch with the Prime Minister's office to get Austria to take decisive steps against the climate crisis and also to commit to renewable energy by 2050. And on top of all this, to come out against attempts to subsidize nuclear power with vast amounts of taxpayer money through mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund. So we were not surprised when the then Austrian Prime Minister, Werner Faymann, said at the leaders event in Paris, atomic energy is not a way to tackle climate change. It's not sustainable, neither in ecological nor in economic terms. Just think of the enormous costs of the unresolved storage of nuclear waste. We were also expecting a stance on an Austrian energy transition, an Austrian Energiewende by him, but were rather surprised that Faymann announced a target of 100% renewable electricity by 2030. He said, again at the leaders event, Austria has an 80% share of renewables in electricity production. We want to further increase this share to 100% by 2030. In our view, renewable energies combined with energy efficiency are clearly the best way forward.
Sorry, Mr. Uhrig,
yes?
We cannot see the presentation. We just see the
very
page.
sorry.
Yeah, so
I probably will have to stop the sharing of the full screen. Can you see this now? Is that better?
Yes, yes, but I guess you will have to click on the individual slides when you want to go.
Unfortunately. Okay, but let me continue with the current situation, but this is where all this started up from. The Paris Climate Conference 2015, where to our moderate surprise, Austria declared that the Austrian leadership declared that they want to change the entire electricity system by 2030 to renewables. The current situation in 2019 is that Austria is currently producing 55 terawatt hours of renewable electricity. This means an actual share of 79% of renewable electricity. This is mostly hydro, as you can see in the graph on the right side. Unfortunately, it will be smaller than if I could have shared the full screen. There's also some biomass. It's about 4.1%, mostly sustainable, as Austria is has very extensive forest cover. So unlike in other parts of the world, such as Canada or US, this can actually be done in a sustainable way. The share of wind and solar has increased fairly strongly over the last 10 years, over the last 15 years, sorry, to currently about 11.3% of generation. But we still have 21% of fossil fuels in the electricity sector, mostly natural gas from cogeneration plants, which are mostly used in the big cities for heating and electricity. I should add as well, this is excluding the balancing of the electricity grid and excluding the industry-owned production when it comes to, for example, the paper industry. Another important factor in the Austrian situation is that Austria, as a very central European country, acts almost as an exchange hub for electricity from net electricity exporters such as Germany and also the Czech Republic, and for net importers, in particular for Hungary, Italy, and in some other countries in the southeast of Europe. Due to the legal situation with electricity labeling, it is currently impossible to distinguish between physical electricity sources in the electricity you actually purchase. All generators of electricity feed into the interconnected European power grid. Electricity certificates can then be used to label this physical electricity, but with no obligation to have a binding match or coupling of physical electricity to the electricity label. And this obviously means that in the average electricity mix in Europe, including the ones coming through Austria, there are certain amounts of nuclear generated electricity and an even larger proportion currently of fossil electricity. Austria is currently a net importer of electricity, 3.1 terawatt hours in 2019. Right. So this for where we are, what happened in 2015 at the Paris Climate Conference. And now 5 years later, 5 years after the Paris Agreement, and after some preliminary steps, the current Austrian government has published a draft of the Erneuerbaren Ausbaugesetz, the Renewables Expansion Law, in September this year, to enter into force next year. And this is the first time that they actually commit to this 100% renewable electricity target in detail. I should have said 100% net renewable electricity, and I will explain this in a bit. This means, as you can see at the bottom, the government plans to massively expand the use of renewable electricity over the last, well, by now 9 years, up to 2030. Per definition, net 100% renewable electricity, the way the government understands it, does not mean no net import. But, well, sorry, it does mean no net import. So 100% renewable provision of electricity in Austria. This does not mean cutting all electricity lines to neighboring countries, which would be absurd. And it also means a certain degree of fossil heat production with electricity cogeneration, in particular in the large cities such as the metropolis of Vienna with almost 2 million inhabitants. This will take longer than 2030 to totally decarbonize, and I will come to this at the end. Right, so again, government plan currently is, in order to achieve this massive expansion of renewable electricity generation, this will be supported by ratepayers with annual financial support of 1 billion euros. Different technologies, and this is what is shown at the bottom of this, are to receive a market premium and or investment aid. This support of 1 billion a year is meant to generate up to 30 billion of total private investment in Austria, and also to secure about 100,000 jobs in the renewables and renovation industry. I will very briefly touch on the cost of technologies comparison, as in particular, Ben Wheeler did a very good overview of the economics of nuclear already before me. But just permit me to compare this, these costs of nuclear to the costs of renewable technologies. Ben Wheeler has mentioned the US investment bank Lazard that publishes the levelized cost of electricity reports now for several years. The current 2020 figures are nuclear at $129 to $198 per megawatt hour. This agrees quite well with Mr. Wheeler's conclusion of a median $150 per megawatt hour. Solar community scale, so large-ish solar projects come to $63 to $94 per megawatt hour. Big scale solar utility scale to $29 to $38 per megawatt hour, and onshore wind to $26 to $54 per megawatt hour. The levelized cost of electricity that Lazard calculates include overnight capital costs, capacity factor of the different generating technologies, the cost of fuel, of operations, and of maintenance. But on the other hand, and this is why this has been criticized quite extensively by at least some pro-nuclear proponents, this approach lacks the representation of the value or indirect cost to the system, and is being seen as poor for comparing technologies that operate differently. When you compare, for example, dispatchable plants that can be started off at short notice versus, to a certain extent, volatile plants that depend on externalities such as the wind and the sun. So just to show you the other approach of comparing the different technologies, this is the International Energy Agency, and as Ben Wheeler and Georga Günsberga in the first part of the conference have already shown, the international energy has been wrong many times, over-optimistic when it comes to nuclear construction costs, totally out of focus when it comes to the potential of solar. But even they, when they use a value-adjusted levelized cost of electricity indicator that builds on the data, for example, used by Lazard, when adding three elements of value, energy, capacity, and flexibility to this indicator, flexibility meaning different operational characteristics of dispatchable versus variable, you still see nuclear way out of any economic cost of the renewables. For Europe, the International Energy Agency calculates the value-adjusted levelized cost of electricity for 2019, nuclear $145 per megawatt hour, solar 85, wind onshore 80, wind offshore 115. What you see on top of the graph is the projections for 2040, which, as I said before, tend to be wrong by the International Energy Agency when it comes to solar. But even then, nuclear is way out of any competitiveness. So the clear conclusion of this is to decarbonize the electricity sector. It is obviously cheaper, and also what has been said before, it is much faster within the relevant timescale of the climate crisis to decarbonize by renewable sources rather than by nuclear power. To come back to the Erneuerbaren Ausbaugesetz, the renewable expansion law that Austria wants to implement from next year on, an important factor to achieve a fast energy transition will be to prioritize citizens' energy projects to sustain the involvement, the buy-in of people, of locals in this transition. In the view of my organization, Global 2000, there are still several problems embedded in the draft law, most notably that the support for these energy communities would only be, well, as drafted at least, in form of investment aid and not of a market premium. This would lead to fairly small projects that aim to supply basically electricity to small communities, which is good in itself, but could result in these communities limiting the size of their projects, as it would be not economical to feed into the grid. And this could thus result in not realizing the full potential of, in particular, rooftop solar on homes and community buildings due to certain restraints, bureaucratic restraints. This could increase the pressure on greenfield solar utility scale, which we see critical. As a matter of fact, we are an environmental organization, so we have proposed to change this in our submission to the consultation process. Another very important aspect that is still missing in the Austrian energy transition is the efficiency part. In the view of Global 2000, what is still also lacking is a clear and binding pathway towards 100% renewable electricity by 2030, combined with the most effective way to decarbonize energy savings, electricity savings. The energy efficiency law is still to be revised. This has not happened yet, and we're pushing for this to happen. The sheer potential in the electricity sector is shown in the calculation of my colleague, as a matter of fact. We also based this calculation on our scenario. We think that it would be possible to supply Austria in a sustainable way with an additional 23.7 terawatts hour per year, rather than the 27 terawatt hours that the government proposes, because we think if we actually save electricity, we don't have to build as much new generating capacities. The potential that my colleague calculated is in heating and warm water about 5 terawatt hours. In lighting 2.4, private electrical appliances such as dishwashers and other big electricity consumers, 1.8 terawatt hours. And in particular also industry motors that tend to be fairly old and tend to be left in service for a long time have another potential of 4 terawatt hours. So in total, there could be an energy savings potential of 13.2 terawatt hours compared to the figures I showed you before, an expansion of 23 to 27 terawatt hours that needs to happen over the next 9 years. Our point is this needs close monitoring of the pathways to clean energy generation, as well as the pathway of energy savings, in order to guarantee that this is done in the most economical and also environmentally friendly way. Okay, so this is it. This is the plan for electricity up to 2030. And then comes the big challenge. Because in order to fully decarbonize the entire system in Austria, this is more than electricity, obviously. The current government put in their work program, again to our surprise, that they want to be carbon neutral by 2040. This would be actually a massive effort. We did a climate and energy scenario, Global 2000, WWF Austria, Greenpeace Austria, and we had a scenario modeled for a total decarbonization of Austria with the electrification of transportation, of industry, including steel production in Linz, with an end to fossil heating systems such as oil and gas heating through renewables, direct heating and ground source heat pumps. the scenario shows that this is possible, but again, the most important aspect is to realize all potential for energy savings first. Insulate homes, use efficient means of transportation, and stop wasting electricity. Thanks for your interest. Thanks very much.
Děkuji, to byl pan Reinhard Uhrig a jeho příspěvek 100% elektřiny z obnovitelných zdrojů jako oficiální cíl vlády Rakouska do roku 2030, teda cesty a možnosti. Vážení přátelé, pokud jste se dívali do sekce Q&A, tak tam jsou otázky, které jsou na jednotlivé panelisty a tímto bych asi mohl zahájit i diskuzi. Tu první otázku bych položil právě skončivšímu Reinhardu Uhrigovi. Pane Uhrigu, Rakousko se 60% vodní energie může skutečně efektivně akumulovat větrnou a solární elektřinu do přečerpávajících vodních stanic, které Rakousko ještě musí postavit během těch bezvětrných nebo zamračených dnů. Česko ale takové hory bohužel a možnosti nemá. Co s tím?
Well, the crucial issue is storage, obviously, and there's quite extensive literature on the possibility of 100% renewable electricity systems or 100% renewable energy systems, to take it fully. And the crucial issue in all of this is storage. You're totally right. Austria is blessed with mountains. There is quite a large proportion of pumped storage hydro in Austria with fairly high efficiency. It has to be said as well. They're 75 to 80% efficient, meaning that it loses 20 to 25% of original electricity through this process of pumping it up and letting it down again when you need it. There are other technologies under development gaining momentum, such as power to gas, meaning power to hydrogen or methane. In our scenario for total decarbonization of Austria, we included this actually, but not for heating homes. It's the gas is much too valuable, the green gas, but for supplying energy to the steelworks in Linz, which will be highly crucial as there are not enough electricity lines linking Linz up to the electricity grid. Excuse me. Another possibility of storage that in particular the city of Vienna currently explores, and also Graz, is power to heat, storing electricity in the form of heat or cooling, either in domestic buildings or on a large scale. And the other possibility, obviously, that has been fallen in price over the last 10 years massively, same as solar photovoltaics, is battery storage. In particular, when it comes to the second life of car batteries that probably won't be fit for an extended period of time in cars, they can still be used for storage for homes for certain appliances. The prices of this have been coming down for the last 10 years. So what I'm saying is, I don't have a solution, obviously, for all countries. We're still struggling with our own system, as you can see, but I think there are ways of even long-term storage options.
Děkuji, pane Uhrigu. Další otázka. Jak chcete zajistit energetickou bezpečnost při 100% výroby z obnovitelných zdrojů energie, aniž byste museli využívat služeb okolních států, které vyrábějí elektřinu z fosilních a jaderných zdrojů?
Well, again, in our view, the challenge will not be to cut off all electricity lines at the borders. Would be stupid. And the best way would be a distributed 100% renewable grid all over Europe, because the sun always shines somewhere, the wind always blows somewhere. So that there will be some sort of net gross export import always. Thank you.
Děkuji. Další otázka na vás, pane Uhrigu. Jak chce Rakousko zajistit uhlíkovou neutralitu v roce 2040, když má zřejmě hodně špatně několik zateplených domů a ty nové se staví také nedobře zateplené? A nebo to není pravda?
That actually is a massive point that my former colleague Georga Günsberga, who is now a government advisor, thankfully I must say, because he's a brilliant man, talked about in the first part of the conference. There is an additional green recovery plan by the Austrian government now in place as a reaction to the corona crisis, saying 2 billion euros, 1 billion per year for the next 2 years of investment aid, in particular into insulating buildings and all other climate-friendly technologies. So we must speed up the insulation of buildings. We must stop wasting energy in general, not just electricity.